So, Abbie, what do you study?
So I study the impact of the criminal justice system on families and communities and how these groups navigate, adapt, and resist oppressive criminalizing tactics. And in addition, I use community voice to determine the kinds of practices, services, resources that should be implemented in order to mobilize marginalized communities and enhance public safety.
What are some of the most interesting findings that your research shows?
Some of the most interesting research findings is that opportunities to expand in terms of networking, in terms of extracurriculars is really where we should be funneling resources. So rather than just being service driven, we should be opportunity driven, meaning that when we think about how to mobilize communities, rather than just investing in the basics such as healthcare, employment and housing, while those things are incredibly important, we also need to invest in opportunities for children specifically to engage in after school activities that can expand their opportunities in the future.
If these things were implemented, what kinds of changes do you expect would occur?
I think that we would see less crime, or I've tried to use the term what is deemed criminal, because I think when we say crime, we think of a capital C crime, capital T truth. And the fact of the matter is that crime is socially constructed. And so I think we would see at least less harm, both being perpetuated by the criminal justice system and also interpersonal violence, because opportunities would exist. I think when we look at communities and you see that there's a high rate of assault in one place or a high rate of robbery in another, rather than deeming these communities as dangerous, we should think about what the needs are and why those activities are so prevalent.
So you talk about crime being socially constructed. For the average person who doesn't know what that means, how is that different than the way we currently understand crime?
Yeah, so I think that we think of crime as static rather than malleable. And what we've seen over time is that our definitions of what is deemed criminal has changed over time. You look at drug laws or thinking about certain prostitution or sex work, all of these things that are slowly being decriminalized or perceived differently by the public. And so I think when we think about crime, it's also important to realize that law is implemented differentially across groups. So while we may believe that murder is inherently or morally bad, it's actually condoned in certain places by certain people, if you think about war or things of that nature. So we have to understand that the ways that we perceive certain activities to be criminal or certain people to be criminal is all a social construct.
So your work has tremendous applications in the policy world. Why did you decide to become an academic?
Yeah, I wanted to be an entrepreneur with a stable income. I wanted to be able to ask the questions that I think some other institutions might be fearful or have too many influencing forces to kind of narrow the scope of research. And I find that academia allows for a more diverse investigation. And I also really love seeing students' perspectives and opinions change over time, and to really have a hand in the future of our society, because these are our future leaders.
All right, so you mentioned that you get to ask questions in academia that other institutions might be too scared to answer. What kinds of questions do you ask in your work, or do you want to ask in your work, that you think others outside of academia are too scared to do?
Well, so one of the research projects that I have coming up is a narrative inquiry and mixed methods study with the Tucson Police Department. And some of the questions are about cultural competence. And I think what's important to note is that the criminal justice system is really just a reflection of our basic social issues. This isn't a special place where racism and oppression solely exists. That's just a reflection of the ways that we actually function as a greater society. And so when I think about the implications of looking into the cultural competence of police officers, the implications are not just to change hiring practices or to implement trainings, but they're to then be implemented in primary, secondary, elementary schools, because we need to create a more culturally competent society as a whole. And so I think those kinds of broad implications, or understanding that the criminal justice system isn't just in isolation and it's constantly impacted by our social dynamics, is something that I think academia allows us to explore.
What is some of the best advice you've ever gotten, or the best advice you think students should hear?
I was told to not take things personally. And I think that this is something that's really important for students to understand, is you're going to be edited and redlined and critiqued throughout your entire educational career. And if you go into graduate school, it's just going to be more. If you go into academia, it's just going to be more. And the truth of the matter is that it's not about you. You can't take the editing personally. And if anything, let go of your ego and just take a minute when you get the edits, take a breath, and understand that eventually, once you implement the changes, it'll just make it so much stronger.
You're a native New Yorker. You were educated on the East Coast. What's it like to now be out in the desert Southwest?
It's hot. It's hot, but it's beautiful, and I love it here. It's one of the things that's really interesting for me in my work is that sometimes I feel like I'm siloed on the East Coast in a very progressive group of people who are thinking similarly. And what's been really interesting about coming to the Southwest is that I think it's much more of an accurate depiction of the American population and the diverse opinions that exist. And so navigating that and having to learn how to communicate outside of my similarly situated group has been really helpful in terms of understanding needs and understanding perspectives.
Last question. What's your secret skill? What's something about you no one knows or the public doesn't know that you're really good at?
I'm very good at keeping plants alive, as I have many plants, and I actually transported over 30 plants in my car when I drove from New York to Phoenix, and they have all maintained their life force. So I'd say maintaining plant life.